The presence of a school within a community can also be strongly related to elevated indicators of broader social and economic welfare, including housing values and local employment. I mentioned the Journal of Research in Rural Education, and there's a quite influential article that was published there by Tom Lyson, who was a faculty member at Cornell, and the article was entitled, I believe, "What a School Means to a Community." And is a very interesting analysis of census data comparing small communities in New York State that had schools versus those that didn't, and the differences in a variety of social and economic indicators, all of which seem to strongly suggest that elevated indicators were associated with the presence of the school. Okay, so this means that those in positions of leadership within a rural school district, including the superintendent and the school board members, necessarily assume not only educational leadership roles, but local economic development roles as well. Therefore, those in leadership positions within rural schools are not only the subjects of public scrutiny, but are far more frequently required to assume community outreach roles and hone community relationship building skills in ways that are less common within urban settings. I'm based in a program called, an educational leadership program, and one of the things that this work has done for me over the years is really forced me to think about not only what educational leadership means, but what specifically rural educational leadership means. And I'm convinced that it has to do with a recognition of the importance of these ties between school and community, and practice that builds on and strengthens these ties. So in other words, much more so than in many other places, the relationship between rural schools and the communities they serve is a deeply symbiotic relationship. Healthy schools beget healthy communities and vice versa. Alternately, this is one of the reasons why the threat of consolidation and school closure is so controversial and anxiety-provoking in rural areas, because of the ways in which schools play such critical local economic, symbolic, and social roles. Okay, so where does this leave us? On the one hand, schools are fundamentally local institutions run by locally elected school boards and occupying the nexus of community educational, social, and economic activity. Educators and educational leaders must therefore be cognizant of and responsive to local needs and issues. On the other hand, schools are institutions of the state and are beholden to the state and national level interests, mandates, and directives. And this tension has deep roots within rural education in the U.S. In the first decades of the 20th century, school reformers in the U.S. began to talk about what became known as the rural school problem. So what reformers were arguing was that rural schools were just too inefficient for the demands of a rapidly changing, urbanizing, and globalizing society. Sound familiar? People in rural communities, reformers believed, were simply ill-equipped to run their own schools and prepare students to be economically competitive and productive in a modernizing world. The solution offered was to make rural schools look a lot more like urban schools, larger, bureaucratized, run by educational professionals rather than locals, and informed by the latest pedagogical knowledge. And in many respects, the debate and the central tensions remain strikingly similar today. And again, I think it's interesting to see how this debate in various ways even bubbles up into our current election debates. Canapel and DeYoung argued nearly a century later, in 1999, that at the heart of the rural school problem is a conflict over the purpose of schooling, with state and national reform leaders typically calling for schools to prepare students to contribute to national interests, while rural education scholars and probably many rural parents believe that rural schools should also serve local community interests. So to me, this is really, really interesting, because it raises these quite difficult questions about the nature of education and the nature of accountability. We throw around words like accountability all the time. But then, I think we can ask, well, to whom is education accountable? Whose purposes does education serve? So this is This is not to say that educational improvement and raising test scores is not desirable, or that we don't want our students to be economically competitive in an increasingly volatile and global economy, but it is to suggest why educational researcher and sociologist Michael Corbett has referred to contemporary schooling within rural areas as the quintessential institution of disembedding. That is, a set of practices that privileges standardization, efficiency, and business models of school management, in the process severing attachment to place and producing mobile, adaptable youth who can flexibly respond to changing labor market conditions on a national and indeed a global scale. So the critique is that standards require curricula and assessment that is purposefully decontextualized, and because curricular standards are so extensive, little opportunity remains for teachers to engage students in curricula tied to locale. Students are geared towards competitiveness in a global marketplace rather than in a local arena, and in a high-stakes accountability environment, the opportunity cost for place-based education may simply just be too high. Or, as a rural administrator once told me, if it doesn't raise test scores, it's just not relevant to my job. Okay, what an interesting quote. So what is education? What is accountability? If it doesn't raise test scores, it's just not relevant to my job.